Hello and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent advancements in science and technology, the people and ideas that make those possible, and the ways in which they advance our whole ultimate goal of human flourishing. I'm Thomas Walker.
And I'm Angelica Worth.
And today we want to make a bit of a break from our usual format. So those who've seen our earlier episodes will know that typically we focus on two recent advancements in different fields, and we do a kind of, a little bit of a dive, but still fairly light touch into each of those. And then we have honourable mentions at the end, which are, kind of even briefer. And so on one hand, we've been thinking, well, this format means we end up covering the same thing quite a lot because, there'll be different advancements in the same field, but we end up making the same general points instead of doing that deeper analysis. So we thought, what if we instead gather together recent advancements where there are several things that overlap in one field and do one really deep detailed dive into that field. And it gives us just the chance to go much deeper and get into the history, the science, the people, not just the most recent parts, but those people who've made that possible over centuries to bring us to where we are. So we've got a few of these lined up. We say we might do some on other topics like space flight or automation or agriculture and farming. But the first one we're going to do, purely because there's been a lot of stories about this recently, is vaccination. Obviously, that's something of a hot topic at the moment with COVID and vaccine mandates, particularly in the US, coming in a lot at the moment. So we'll touch on that when we get there. But I should just say, to be clear at the start, that we're not telling anyone what they should or shouldn't do. We just want to talk about the science and the history of something that really has done a lot for human flourishing over the centuries. So with that out of the way, would you like to kick us off?
Absolutely. So the first advancement we wanted to cover is 3D printed vaccine patches. So rather than an injection with a needle, which some people are scared of needles, they can be quite painful. It's a rectangular patch that's polymer with microneedles on there, so it doesn't hurt at all when it's stuck onto your skin.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, that's very helpful for those who have needle phobias.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've got a friend who's, doesn't want to get vaccinated because of a genuine, serious phobia of needles. That's something not to be scoffed at.
Right. And so this is supposed to not only be more comfortable for the patient, but also you don't need any training to stick a patch on. You literally just stick it on your arm. Anybody could literally do it to themselves, which is a factor in developing worlds that don't have as many trained medical personnel. But another thing that's cool about this advancement is how it's being developed. So there's a man named Joseph de Simone who's leading the research, and he is actually a 3D printing entrepreneur. Ooh. And so he developed the 3D printer that they're using for the study, which is pretty cool. He's working with Stanford and the University of North Carolina, and they've only tested it on animals so far, but it produced an immune response in the animals that was about 10 times stronger than the average vaccine that we have now.
So it gets you around the unpleasantness of needles and actually increases the efficacy.
Yeah, they'll honestly probably have to dial it back because 10 times the immune response is kind of too much.
Right.
So they'll have to dial it back, but the fact is they're super effective. They're completely painless for the person. You don't need trained medical personnel to put them on, and on top of it, storage and shipping is super easy. You were talking about the COVID vaccine a little bit, and most of those, not all of them, need to be held at a very specific temperature throughout the whole storage and shipping process, but these don't. So tons of benefits, and hopefully we'll see expanded research on that, and it's starting to be used in coming years.
Yeah, and one of the other ones I wanted to talk about in terms of recent developments is another alternative to needles in terms of administration, which is a nasal spray for COVID-19. But similarly to yours, really, that not only gets you around the sort of problems that some people have with needles, but also increases efficacy because the nose is the first line of defense against respiratory, I think you say.
Respiratory,
as we say over here, infection. So it's coming in through the nose a lot of the time. So if you can strengthen resistance there before it actually gets into the rest of your system, you can reduce its strength before it's hitting other parts of your body. So the nasal spray, and this is it's a group of 12 researchers published in iScience magazine, or journal, putting forward some quite detailed science that was possibly a little over my head in terms of how this specifically works. but it strengthens that first line of defense, and again, it's something that hopefully will appeal to more people than having a needle in your arm will.
Right, and they have like nasal sprays already for certain as treatments for certain diseases and sinus infections and things like that. So
it's exactly the same kind of principle as that. And did you have another for us?
Yeah. One more advancement that's relatively recent in the field of vaccines is this team led by a man named Robert Sater.
All these names leading things.
Yes, but they have developed a method by which they genetically engineer hamsters to produce antibodies. This is kind of the opposite of the one you just explained, is rather than developing a front line of defense, we're kind of hacking later into the process of how your immune system responds to a virus, or in this case, a parasite.
Right.
Because this, I guess I should have mentioned, that the antibodies are against malaria.
Right, okay.
Which is obviously a really serious disease, particularly in Africa.
Yeah.
And it causes all kinds of problems. So basically how this works is the hamsters are genetically engineered to, their ovaries, produce antibodies against malaria, which are then given to the patients. And this trial actually got disrupted by COVID. But that kind of
by lockdowns in response to COVID, yeah.
But that kind of ended up being a good thing because they took longer to test the patients to see if they were still immune to malaria than they had planned to. And they found that the immunity lasts at least 6 months.
Oh, wow.
Which is quite good. So that was basically how that trial worked. Now, there are 2 caveats to this one. It has been tested on the people, and like I said, in that first 6-month range, it did very well. But people who have been exposed to malaria repeatedly, particularly people living in parts of Africa where malaria is a problem, tend to develop kind of a more complicated immune response. And so Sater says he's not going to break out the champagne until he has data from Africa. Right. And the other thing is just, at the moment, it's still quite expensive. I imagine hamsters take a lot to take care of, and then the gene editing on top of it, and then getting the antibodies from them. The whole thing is just really expensive right now. And so until that cost comes down, it's probably not going to be a major part of the fight against malaria.
But it may be.
But it may be in the future. Yeah, we've talked about on this show before how things often start out very expensive, and then with use and innovations, they become cheaper. Yeah. So it's a starting point.
Cool, yeah.
And did you want to talk those? So I mentioned that this plan involves antibodies, which kind of jumps ahead a little bit in the immune system process. So did you want to explain just kind of briefly how your immune system responds to vaccines and pathogens generally?
Yeah, well, I should probably start off with how your immune system responds just to something coming into it.
Yeah.
So when a sort of foreign body enters your system, you produce a particular kind of protein called an antibody, which is designed to fight off whatever particular thing has come in. So if something unknown comes in, then your body has to sort of identify it and learn how to respond to it. So what vaccines do is they give you the ability to have those antibodies without you having to actually contract the infection itself. So there's a couple of different ways that this is done, and I think there's sort of a general popular perception of how vaccines work, which is that they use a weakened version of the particular infection that you're dealing with. That is sometimes the case, but it's not often the case now. So some earlier vaccines would use either a weakened or completely inert form of the virus to try and trick your body into producing the antibodies. And then also another solution is with viruses like coronaviruses, which have spike proteins on the outside.
We've all seen at this point the graphic of the little balls with the spiky doodles coming out.
Yeah, so the spiky doodles. So you another solution is to just dump a whole load of those into your system and try and encourage your body to produce antibodies based on those. But you're doing a kind of trial and error there in terms of whether that will work or not. What's more interesting nowadays, and what several of the COVID vaccines are, is mRNA vaccines.
This is also the cancer vaccines we were talking about a couple weeks ago.
And what those do is sort of a difficult thing to understand, but what they do is they actually instruct your own cells to manufacture the spike protein from the virus. So there's nothing from the virus going into you when you're vaccinated. What's going into you is something that instructs you to produce the spike protein from the virus. Just the spike by itself, so you're not producing a complete virus. It's like producing the hand of a, it's like you're not creating the whole thing. But that's enough for your body to go, virus here. So it learns how to react to the virus without actually having to encounter it. And are you going to take us through some of the history of that?
Not yet. I wanted to first cover, we'll get there. But before that, I wanted to just kind of dig in a little bit on the process of how you make those antibodies and and how that works, just in a little bit more detail after that excellent overview you just gave. So when the pathogen enters your body, or any sort of foreign substance that provokes an immune response, the first part that reacts to it in your immune system are called B cells. And your B cells produce the antibodies you were talking about. And the antibodies, as you were saying, they kind of have to be specific to the pathogen, because otherwise they won't be able to do their main job, which is to bind to the pathogen. And so that's how I remember it, is B cells bind.
Right.
Except B cells make antibodies that bind. But
okay. As an aid memoir, it works.
Yes. And the antibodies, when they bind, sometimes they're able to neutralize the pathogen just like that. That's all it takes. But more often, their main purpose really is to tag the pathogen for destruction.
So it's like when spies laser tag a target for a plane to take out.
Yes. With planes?
Like a fighter jet does a targeted bombing because somebody's painted a target with a... That's a thing.
Okay, if you say so. But sure, like that then. And then your T cells come in and actually take out the pathogen. So I had I can't take credit for this memory aid because a biology teacher taught it to me. But the T cells you can think of as the terminator cells. They come in and finish off the actual pathogens.
Yeah.
But the key thing is here, when your B cells make those antibodies, not all of them are used right away. And so some of them stay. And that's why you talk about people having antibodies once they've had COVID, for example.
Yeah, and one other thing that's often added to vaccines like this is what's called an adjuvant. So in addition to what I described earlier, either using a weaker form of the virus or that genetic instruction, a lot of vaccines also include additional elements, not elements in the chemical sense, but additional parts that sometimes it is an element in the chemical sense, which improve the efficacy of the vaccine. So this is kind of like a catalyst in chemistry. It's an extra element that's not in the reaction itself, but is encouraging the reaction to happen. So you'll talk a bit later, I think, about Alexander Glenny, who sort of pioneered this with the use of aluminium as an adjuvant, but also sugars from cell membrane walls are used, forms of oils are used, and nowadays, actually, we're coming into synthetic adjuvants as well. So, specifically manufactured proteins and things that will actually, just act as a kind of catalyst for the, production of antibodies.
Sure. So one thing that's interesting about all of this is, we have this complex system nowadays, but vaccination has gone on in some form or another for quite a while. And so I was curious, how did that actually start? And the earliest reference I could find is when Buddhist monks back in 17th century China would drink snake venom in order to immunize themselves against the bite of snakes. Don't recommend. But
if you live in a snake-infected region, don't go around drinking their venom.
Which is, a point we wanted to draw out here, is that these early methods, although there was something to them, they were quite dangerous.
Yeah.
But they weren't as dangerous as the actual issue. If you drink diluted snake venom, you are at a risk of dying, but you are at a lower risk of dying than if a snake bit you and you hadn't done that. It's kind of like, but over time it can have some other effects too. It's like, if you guys have seen the Hunger Games, President Snow would drink poison because he was so used to poisoning other people, he wanted to be immune to it if somebody ever tried to poison him, or if he accidentally drank out of a poison cup that was meant for somebody else.
Right, yeah.
So, let's not be President Snow.
Yeah, because he ended up killing himself anyway doing that. Didn't he? Spoiler warning for a movie that came out in 2015.
Right. But the science did progress a little bit over the next couple hundred years.
What you're describing there about the risk factor of some of these earlier versions applies to what I wanted to talk about as well, which is the process called variolation, which I discovered while I was reading Johann Norberg's book Progress, which I highly recommend. But so variolation is kind of the direct precedent to vaccination. And this was during the smallpox, well, I want to say smallpox outbreak, but that's really like the whole of history before smallpox was defeated. And what they would do there is find someone who had a sort of weaker form of smallpox, and then sort of create wounds on people and rub. It's quite unpleasant, but rub the sort of output of people's sores into other healthy people, but they were coming from these weak cases. So it's basically spread the weaker form of smallpox and infect people with it deliberately, and then they end up being protected against those stronger forms that are fatal or highly harmful. And that process killed a whole lot of people. Like, it had a fatality rate that would be just completely unacceptable. For we sort of go a bit crazy if a few people get blood clots from a vaccine now, but this is 2-5% of people die when they get this thing. But the smallpox situation was so severe that was still a massive reduction in fatalities over just letting smallpox do its thing.
Because that even at the 5% rate, the rate of death from smallpox was 35%.
Yeah.
So
it's just another level to what we're used to today. Mm-hmm. So although it seems shockingly, and I think you pointed out to me that King George III's son died after being variolated.
Yeah.
But as I say, it was still a huge step forward for quality of life, and saved a lot more people than it cost.
Right, and so variolation, I think, also started in China, but quickly caught on in other places, in Northern Africa and Europe and other parts of Asia. But vaccinology, as we think of it a little bit more formally nowadays, started in the West with a man named Edward Jenner, who in 1796 published his work that showed that by infecting somebody, in this case I think it was like a teenage boy, with cowpox, which is very similar to smallpox, he then became immune to smallpox, which Jenner didn't start by experimenting on teenage boys. He noticed that milkmaids who spent a lot of time with cows were immune to smallpox, right, and wondered why that was. So that research came out in 1796 and led to the development of a smallpox vaccine using cowpox that came out in 1798. So that was the beginning of modern vaccination as we think of it.
And that's exactly the same time that we were talking about George III's son, so that's coming right off the back of variolation. If we jump forward sort of about a century or so, the French chemist Louis Pasteur is sort of the next big name in vaccine development, and he was working on vaccines for cholera and anthrax. Anthrax is sort of sometimes still in the news because it's used as a sort of bioweapon nowadays, but it was something that you had to be seriously concerned about a couple hundred years ago. And those actually both came out after his death. He died in 1895, and other people carried on his work and finished developing those. I think 1897 for the cholera vaccine and 1905 for the anthrax vaccine.
1904.
1904, sorry. Thank you for catching that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that people still, well, positive I think, not just interesting, that people still continue Louis Pasteur's work on to this day through the Pasteur Institute, which still is on the cutting edge of vaccine research, and a nonprofit that continues on in that vein. The next big step forward in vaccine science in the 1900s we wanted to call out in a positive way is the work of Alexander Glennie, who you mentioned briefly before, was the first one to use an adjuvant in his vaccines. And so what he did specifically is he used aluminum salts added to the diphtheria vaccine. The results of this work were published in 1926 and found that it made it much more efficacious. But work continued over the next couple decades.
Yeah, so the other next big thing we want to highlight is the development of DTaP, or DTaP is a little a, in 1948, which was the first ever what they call combo vaccine. So I think those of you who sort of I think probably most people, if not everyone watching this show, sort of grew up in a country where you get these combo vaccines as a child, and they take care of several different things at once. And I had the BCG when I was younger. I can't remember what's in that, but
the MMR vaccine is a big one in the US.
Yeah, and DTaP was diphtheria, tuberculosis, and I always forget the third one.
It's whooping cough, which is the proper name for whooping cough is pertussis. So that's where the P comes from.
I always want to say potassium. I know that's not right.
Potassium is good for you.
but in the right quantities. But so yeah, that was the next big step, is being able to protect people against more than you not having to have a whole bunch of different things for every single, but being able to combine them together.
Right, and they're still working on new versions of that, but it was worth noting that whooping cough is particularly a problem for children, and it was a pediatrician by the name of Layla Denmark who developed that vaccine.
Yeah, I forgot to
In 1948, I think it was.
Yeah.
So looking at just all of these accomplishments and what they've actually done for the world, it's really quite remarkable, and we wanted to highlight a few particular areas where major progress against diseases have been made, primarily through the use of vaccines, although increased hygiene also helps.
Yeah, that makes cleanliness of water, washing regularly. People didn't wash at all in the past. It's shocking when you read into it.
Yeah.
One bath a month was considered elaborate. Yeah.
Yeah. And lice were a major problem in a lot of areas, even up through the 1940s in some places.
Yeah.
But anyway, first major victory is over smallpox, which, obviously that's one that we've been battling for hundreds of years, but in 1979 it was announced that it's considered eradicated completely. And like we said before, it's got a 35% death rate, so this is not trivial.
Yeah.
And even if you didn't die from it, you often ended up blind or scarred from it. So major long-term effects, and so eradicating it was a huge step forward. Now, smallpox is the only human disease that's been totally eradicated by vaccines, but there are a few others that we've made major steps towards eradicating, and they're almost eradicated or eradicated in almost the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, polio is the obvious example of that, because if you talk about polio now, it's just a thing from the past as far as America or Europe or the developed world's concerned. But it's still present in Africa, but it's even in Africa it's incredibly geographically limited.
Mm-hmm.
It's just these occasional outbreaks in really quite remote and underdeveloped areas. But the if you've seen the pictures from the early part of the 20th century when the polio outbreak was severe in America and in Europe, these rooms full of people in these sort of bed units, and again it's crippling even if you do live with it. So that's probably only a couple decades away from being totally eradicated. It's just those hard to reach poorest areas that are still dealing with it.
Yeah, and as infrastructure and communication improves, I'm sure that will help, because if you can't vaccinate a whole population, the next best thing is they call it like ring something.
Ring of roses?
I don't know. But basically the idea is when you get a report of a disease that's almost eradicated that we have a vaccine for, like polio, you then vaccinate everyone that could have had contact with that person.
Yeah.
Which is easier when we have, phone lines and the internet and things like that. So other things are helping in these fights as well. But still a huge accomplishment. Another big one is tetanus, which tetanus used to have a death rate of like 11%, and we've brought the incidence of that disease down by about 89% just in the last couple decades, since 1990, I think that figure is. So huge improvements there. But vaccines aren't just for people.
Yeah, so I mean, you'll talk a bit later about how vaccines, how pathogens being in other species presents a challenge, but vaccination also helps treat diseases that are particular to other species that don't affect us. And one really significant example of that is rinderpest, which sounds like a city in Germany or Hungary, but it was a disease that affected cows, buffalo, and animals in that general family, sort of flat-hooved.
So it doesn't affect us directly, but those are livestock animals, so it does affect human flourishing.
Yeah, and well, there's other ways in which that's true as well, but in this case, it had actually up to 100% fatality rate in cows. It was the 100% was if it was in a population that had no existing immunity and had basically been isolated until that point. But even in other populations, it was alarmingly high fatality rates, and then some very unpleasant things that happened before it got to that point. And but the other thing is some animals we use obviously for livestock or for sort of beast of burden functions. Some we have pet relationships with. We wouldn't want an outbreak in our dogs or cats. And then there's also that risk, particularly with mammals that are closer to us, that these things may jump species, as we've seen. So it's always, I think, in our interest to try and reduce pathogens just generally.
Yeah, there's certainly an argument to be made there, and that relates to the two big challenges to eradication. So, as amazing as these accomplishments are, certain diseases are quite stubborn. There are still some diseases like malaria that we don't have a firm answer to. And so there are two really main reasons that we can't eradicate every disease we can develop a vaccine for. And one of them was what you were just talking about, the fact that some vaccines can affect people too. So one example of that is yellow fever is a great candidate for vaccination.
Some vaccines can affect people too?
Oh, sorry, some diseases. Some diseases can affect people too. And so a great example of that is, horrible example of that is yellow fever, which, you might have to get a vaccine for that if you're going to a tropical area where it's common.
Yeah,
But
I remember when I went to Hong Kong, I didn't have to get vaccinated for it, but it was a big deal in the airport because they were getting people in from places that...
Sure, yeah. And so the thing with yellow fever, we have a vaccine for it, but yellow fever also affects monkeys, and it's not just that you have to be in contact with the monkey. Mosquitoes will bite both humans and monkeys and carry yellow fever between them.
Right, yeah.
And so you would literally, to completely eradicate yellow fever, you would have to not only vaccinate all the people in the given area, but also all the monkeys in the given area, or kill all the mosquitoes. Which is
all the monkeys.
Also,
Yeah.
well, don't kill the monkeys. I like monkeys.
But it's difficult to go...
But it's difficult. Any of these
find all the monkeys
populations.
in a forest somewhere
Yeah.
and vaccinate all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's obviously a huge challenge. And then the other big challenge is just the nature of the disease and our immune system. So what I mean by that is the likelihood of a disease to produce variants.
Yeah.
That's not what it's called. Mutate.
Yeah.
That's what it's called.
Yeah.
Which we've seen already with COVID. There's the fact that some diseases just don't provoke a strong enough immune response that it stays in your body forever. So like if you got smallpox as a child or chickenpox, you're immune for the rest of your life. We've already seen with COVID, that's only been around about 2 years, and people have already had it twice.
Yeah.
And
And this happens with the cold. Like
This happens
every
with
year
cold,
there's
yeah.
a new cold, there's a new flu.
there's new
With
colds, there's
that-
new flus, and also just the fact of colds, there actually aren't that many variants of colds. It's just that it doesn't produce a strong enough immune response for you to have that many antibodies in your body to be able to fight it off very well.
Well,
The
yeah.
next time you get a cold.
I mean, I've been dealing with a cold for the last week or two, and the fact that we've been social distancing and everything because of coronavirus has actually left us more exposed to the cold because we sort of skipped a year of fighting it. So I mean, I've done fine, but some people are having to go to hospital with the cold, which is more so than normal in this country. It's causing a bit of alarm, just because there's weakened immunity and weakened familiarity with it in our systems,
Sure.
because of that extra year. I just wanted to kind of come back to a broader overview and talk about why vaccination is cool in a way, because
More than cool.
I mean it's a wonderful thing, and I think it's a really interesting example of us kind of hacking nature. And I think it comes back to that point that some people, I think, perceive nature as being this wonderful, beautiful thing and full of life, and technology and mankind as being kind of the sort of cold and aggressive opposite to it. And if anything, the opposite is true. Like, the nature is this violent, horrible thing that's always out to kill you, and we are incredibly good at turning that into a safe, healthy, welcoming environment.
No, that viewpoint is assuming that humans aren't part of nature, but that's...
I mean, we are. I think it's necessary, and I think following that line of thinking, if people complain about cities blighting the earth or anything, I think we're part of nature, and our rational faculty and our the way we create technologies and change the world is in itself part of our nature. So you could see technology as an extension of nature, and buildings and cars and things are just another thing that's evolved out of the history of life, but at the same time, the fact that we are rational beings who solve problems instead of just reacting to them instinctively sets us apart in a crucial way from the natural world. And so there is, I don't think seeing it as a sort of a war is a good idea, because we do rely on nature for a lot of things, but at the same time, as say, nature is violent and horrible, to say the least. There's some wonderful, colourful examples of how horrible nature can be if you look at the natural world. But all of these pathogens are good examples of that, and we end up having to deal with more of them because every one we solve we live a bit longer and then we run into the next thing. Cancer wasn't an issue until we started not dying of heart disease, and suddenly cancer becomes more of a problem, and so that's always going to be the case. But this isn't just like building a building with air conditioning and fighting off the cold. We're actually hacking nature and using it in our defense. And I think that's really cool, especially when we're on a genetic level, actually programming our cells to manufacture things. But even just the simple, like using one pathogen against another is a really good example of how human ingenuity can be turned to defend us against a natural world that is really not pro our survival a lot of the time.
Yes. But that being said, on the subject of human nature, in order to really survive and live as a human, you have to be able to use that rational faculty you were talking about. You have to be able to act on your rational judgment. And so that is what gives rise to the idea that you should be able to make choices about what's going into your own body. And the vaccines, as we've touched on a little bit, all vaccines have some level of risk. And as much as, the overall anti-vax movement, I'm not talking about the COVID people who don't want to get the COVID vaccine here, but the overall anti-vax movement, which is largely regarded as irrational, the one positive I think that came from it is that it made people more aware of the risks. Giving people autism is not one of the risks, but there are risks. There are.
They're always going, any substance you introduce into your body carries a level of risk.
Right. And I think there's some level of, it's somewhat reasonable to be concerned about those risks and how much. And really, it should come down to a risk-benefit analysis for each individual, and maybe in concert with your doctor, if appropriate. But at the end of the day, it's your choice. And so at the end of the day, that means that it's not okay for the government to tell you that you need to take a vaccine.
Yeah, because that's a violation of rights on the government's part. But at the same time, it's really important to... this applies to everything in life, not just vaccination, but it's really important with these things to get the data yourself and do your own rational analysis of it and not run on people's opinions. And that may be, the opinion of an anti-vaxxer or maybe the opinion of a Fauci type. But, neither of those is a good way to make decisions. The way to make decisions is to find the facts for yourself and use logic and rationality to arrive at this. And you and I both took that approach, or we both decided to get vaccinated in the case of COVID-19, but then you've decided to get the flu vaccine and I haven't. And that's just because I don't consider myself to be at much risk of it. But
I just don't want it. It's just a horrible situation, and I don't want to be in bed for a week with it.
But I think we can all respect people who, and it's different with COVID because these vaccines are so new.
Yeah.
And so I've spoken to a lot of people, some very rational, very scientific people who are, I think, legitimately cautious because these side effects of these vaccines just aren't well understood yet.
Right.
They are quite well understood, but
it's
not been long enough to know all of them. And I think just in terms of probability, I doubt there's anything significant. But I can respect being hesitant about that as long as you know why you're hesitant and have the right information and have done that in a balanced way.
Right. And so a key thing that I want to compare this to, because really we all want to be trying to make rational, informed decisions as much as possible, and the internet has helped a lot with that. In the case of COVID, you can go and find a lot of the papers on COVID for free online if you want to go to the original data, which I would encourage you to do. But it's like another thing that drives me nuts that people don't want to take people don't want to consume, but it is their choice, is GMOs. And we've talked about GMOs on this show a little bit before. But basically, the reason it bothers me is because so many people who don't want GMOs or who would prefer not to have GMOs, even if they're not demonizing them, don't even know what a GMO is. There are a small portion of people who can't even tell you what it stands for, but won't eat it. And I've seriously have seen videos of these people.
I mean, it brings me back to that point about nature's not, the idea that organic food is somehow better for you than, modified food. Have you ever tried to eat an organic banana? They're inedible.
But yeah, so I mean, the point is, if you choose not to eat GMOs, fine. That's your choice, but I would encourage you to make it a rational, informed choice to understand what a GMO is and make your decision based on that, because a lot of people don't.
Yeah, and it's the same with the vaccine, isn't it? I mean, it's, at least if you've watched this episode, you've got a very basic grounding, but you can go a lot deeper than that. And actually, understand what the science is.
And we were purposely not focusing on the COVID vaccine here. If you wanted to dig in more on the science of the COVID vaccine or any vaccine you're considering taking, it's much easier to do so nowadays, and we would encourage you to do so. And if you have a health condition that maybe makes you a little bit more cautious, definitely talk to a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that I think I intended to mention earlier and didn't when I was talking about, the phobias with needles is it's also very legitimate. Anyone who's got allergies or a weakened immune system, then you definitely need to be careful in that situation. Because it's that balance of risk of, are you more at risk from catching the virus itself or getting that vaccine.
And if you have a complicated immune system or situation with your immune system, if you're immunocompromised because of medications you're on, because you had a organ transplant, I've got somebody in my family who fits that description, or if you have just an immuno disease, those situations tend to be so complicated that I would really caution you against just going to the internet for advice.
Yeah.
Talk to your doctor. They know what medications you're on. They know what your surgery history is. They know what your disease specifically is if you have one. They're going to be in a much better position to give you advice than anybody else.
Yeah.
But one other thing on the subject of vaccines being required, we want to clarify, I think, that when we say that the government shouldn't make you take a vaccine, that is not the same thing as a business requiring you to have a vaccine.
Yeah, so... and there's sort of another distinction to make here, which is there's a big difference between a business deciding to require that of its staff and the government forcing a business to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the UK, we don't have any vaccine mandates in this country at the moment, and or at least not that I'm aware of. Certainly not outside of government workers or anything like that. And but we do have a number of businesses who've said, we're going to require it of people, and they've just done that independently. And some people have criticised them, and some people have supported them, and that's kind of how the market works. Is that a business really ought to be able to say whatever it likes in terms of what it's under what terms it wants to trade with people, because when you employ someone, you're trading with them. But it should, like any other business that trades in any way, expect the outcome of that if they do something stupid. And I'm not saying that that requirement is stupid, but if you're required that people work standing on one leg or something, then you're going to get the result that you would expect from that.
Well, this is the thing that's not talked about enough when people talk about conditions of employment or how employers treat their employees. The conditions you have for employment directly affect how many and what quality of employee you can get.
Yeah, but to sort of bring it back on topic a bit, where was I going with that? Yeah, so if the government's compelling a business to do that, then that's taking it out of the business's hands, and you have a situation like you have with the airlines in the US at the moment, where businesses are caught in between a rock and a hard place. Mm-hmm. They actually have no choice but to lay people off, whether they want to or not.
I'm sure they don't want to. Most of them are quite understaffed right now.
Yeah, so that doesn't help anyone. But equally, I think it's perfectly legitimate for a business to require that. It makes possibly more sense if it's a business where transmission risk is higher, like you're working in a medical establishment or something, and you really don't.
If you're working around vulnerable people.
Or a care home or something like that, then I think it's quite legitimate if you're working in a situation where there's elderly people or immunocompromised people, that your employer should expect you to be taking precautions for those people. So I think that's quite legitimate.
Yeah, but to wrap up, today we talked about a few recent advancements in vaccines, specifically the 3D printed vaccine patches, the intranasal COVID vaccine, and the genetically engineered hamsters that produce antibodies for malaria. And we then went on to talk about what the actual science of vaccines is, how they work scientifically, and a little bit of the history of vaccines. And we wrapped it up with a discussion of vaccines and the current situation in regards to philosophy, from a philosophic perspective, what are vaccines really, and looking at politics about whether vaccines should be required in different circumstances and why. And I just want to end, I think, with a sincere expression of the fact that vaccines generally are a very good thing, but it is still your personal choice, and I urge you to make a rational and informed choice. Not you, because I know you already did. Everyone else. And if you're not sure, please check with your doctor.
Yeah.
But overall, vaccines are wonderful for human flourishing, and that's why we wanted to celebrate them on Innovation Celebration. And there's tons of innovations stretching back hundreds of years now, but even more recently, that are worth celebrating. So.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.